Emily had always loved photography. Ever since she received her first camera as a child, she had been fascinated by capturing moments in time. Now, as a college student majoring in photography, she spent most of her free time exploring abandoned places, looking for the perfect shot. One afternoon, Emily was browsing through a dusty old thrift store when she came across an antique camera. It was a beautiful, ornate piece, with intricate designs etched into the metal casing. The shop owner, an elderly man with a knowing look in his eyes, offered it to her for a suspiciously low price. "Be careful with that one," he warned. "It has a history." Emily laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to add to the allure. She bought the camera and headed home, eager to try it out. That night, Emily decided to test the camera in her apartment. She set up some candles and arranged a few objects to create an eerie, atmospheric scene. As she looked through the viewfinder, she noticed something strange. In the reflection of the mirror she was photographing, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. Startled, Emily turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off as a trick of the light and continued taking pictures. After developing the film in her makeshift darkroom, she noticed something even more unsettling. The shadowy figure appeared in every single photo, growing closer and more defined with each shot. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily decided to take the camera to one of her favorite abandoned locations, the old Fairview Asylum. The asylum had been closed for decades, and local legends spoke of restless spirits and eerie happenings. Emily arrived at the asylum just before sunset. The decaying building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows broken and its walls covered in ivy. She felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of mold and decay. She began exploring the asylum, snapping photos of the crumbling walls and forgotten rooms. Every now and then she felt a cold breeze brush past her, even though the air was still. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she ventured deeper into the building, she came across a room that seemed untouched by time. The walls were lined with old photographs, each one depicting patients of the asylum. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Emily approached the mirror, wiping away the dust with her sleeve. As she looked into it, she saw the shadowy figure again, standing right behind her. This time, it was clearer than ever before. A tall, dark shape with glowing eyes. Panic surged through her as she turned around, but the room was empty. She raised the camera and snapped a photo of the mirror, hoping to capture whatever was haunting her. The flash illuminated the room for a brief moment, revealing the figure standing in the corner. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her hands shaking. She knew she had to leave, but something compelled her to stay. She continued taking pictures, each flash revealing more of the sinister presence around her. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway where a locked door stood. Desperate for answers, she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She raised the camera one last time and took a photo of the door. The flash revealed a horrifying scene. The room beyond was filled with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Emily stumbled back, dropping the camera. She turned to run, but the figures were closing in on her, their whispers filling her ears. She felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder, and everything went black. When Emily woke up, she was lying on the floor of the asylum, the camera shattered beside her. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the building, not stopping until she reached her car. She drove home, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Back in her apartment, she tried to piece together what had happened. She developed the remaining film from the camera, her hands trembling. The photos revealed the full extent of the horror she had witnessed. Dozens of shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with malevolence. Emily knew she had to get rid of the camera. She packed it up and returned to the thrift store, but the shop was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. She realized the shop owner had never intended for her to return. Desperate, she drove to the nearest river and hurled the camera into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. She hoped that would be the end of it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching her. Months passed, and Emily tried to move on with her life. But every time she looked through her new camera, she saw glimpses of the shadowy figures lurking in the background. She realized that the curse wasn't tied to the camera, it was tied to her. Emily had unknowingly become the subject of the very horror she sought to capture. No matter where she went, the shadows followed. And as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, she knew she could never escape the darkness that had claimed her.
Jake was an avid collector of rare and unusual antiques. His small apartment was filled with oddities from all over the world, each piece with its own story, its own history. But despite his impressive collection, he was always on the lookout for something truly unique, something that would stand out among the rest. One rainy afternoon, Jake found himself wandering through the winding alleys of a city he'd never visited before. The rain drizzled down, making the cobblestones slick and reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. As he turned a corner, he noticed a small, unassuming shop nestled between two larger buildings. Its wooden sign, barely readable through the grime, read, "Curiosities and Relics." Intrigued, Jake pushed open the creaky door, a small bell jingling as he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with all sorts of strange and fascinating objects. Ancient books, tarnished jewelry, and statues from distant lands. But what caught Jake's eye was a large, ornate mirror leaning against the back wall. It was framed in dark, intricately carved wood that seemed to writhe and twist like a mass of serpents. The glass itself was slightly clouded, as though it had been untouched for centuries. But the most striking feature was the faint, almost imperceptible glow emanating from its surface. As Jake approached the mirror, he felt a strange pull, as if the mirror was calling to him. He could have sworn he saw something move within the glass, but when he looked closer, it was just his own reflection staring back at him. An elderly woman emerged from the shadows of the shop, her eyes sharp and knowing. "That mirror has a long and dark history," she said in a voice that was both soft and commanding. "It's said to be cursed, to trap the souls of those who become too obsessed with their own reflection." Jake, ever the skeptic, dismissed her warning with a smile. "I'll take it," he said, not thinking twice about the ominous tone in her voice. The woman hesitated, but then nodded, accepting his payment with a look that seemed to say she was glad to be rid of the mirror. That night, Jake brought the mirror home and placed it in his bedroom, hanging it on the wall opposite his bed. As he lay down to sleep, he found his eyes drawn to it, the faint glow casting an eerie light across the room. He could feel the mirror's presence, almost as if it was watching him. Over the next few days, Jake began to notice strange things happening in his apartment. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, nothing was there. Objects seemed to shift positions on their own, and at night, he heard soft whispers that seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. One evening, as Jake was getting ready for bed, he stood in front of the mirror, running a hand through his hair. He froze when he noticed something odd. His reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it stared back at him with a cold, empty expression. Jake stepped back in shock, his heart pounding, but the reflection remained motionless, its eyes fixed on him. Panicked, Jake turned away, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. He spun back to face the mirror, only to see his reflection smiling, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, the glass rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone, and Jake felt a cold hand grip his wrist, pulling him toward the mirror. He struggled, but the grip was too strong. The whispers became deafening, and as Jake was pulled closer, he saw other faces in the mirror, pale, ghostly faces with hollow eyes and twisted expressions. They were trapped, their souls imprisoned within the glass, and they were calling to him, begging him to join them. With one last desperate effort, Jake broke free, stumbling back onto the floor. The room was cold, the light dimmed, and the mirror's glow pulsed with a sinister energy. Jake knew he had to get rid of it. The next morning, Jake wrapped the mirror in a thick blanket and drove to the outskirts of town, where he found an isolated field. He dug a deep hole and buried the mirror, hoping that would be the end of it. But the nightmares began that night. Jake dreamt of the mirror, its surface no longer clouded but clear as crystal, showing him visions of the lost souls trapped inside. He saw their lives, their torment, and their desperate attempts to escape. And each night, the dreams became more vivid, more terrifying, as if the mirror was reaching out to him even from beneath the earth. Jake's health began to deteriorate. He became paranoid, seeing the faces from the mirror in every reflective surface, in windows, in puddles, even in the glint of a spoon. The voices returned, whispering to him in the dead of night, urging him to dig up the mirror and free them. Unable to take it any longer, Jake returned to the field. He dug frantically, his hands blistered and bleeding, until he uncovered the mirror. It was no longer wrapped in the blanket but was clean, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. With trembling hands, Jake lifted the mirror, staring into its depths. The faces were there, clearer than ever, their eyes pleading. And there in the center was his own reflection, grinning that same twisted grin he had seen before. The cold hand reached out from the glass again, but this time Jake didn't resist. He felt himself being pulled into the mirror, the world around him fading as he was drawn into the cold, dark void. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the sound of his own voice, whispering from the mirror's surface, now one of the many lost souls trapped within. The next day, Jake's apartment was eerily quiet. His friends, worried after not hearing from him for days, came to check on him. They found the place empty, with no sign of Jake or the mirror. Only a single ominous message was left scrawled on the wall in a shaky hand. "Beware the mirror of lost souls." And from that day forward, anyone who entered Jake's apartment felt a strange presence, as if they were being watched. Some claimed to hear whispers coming from the walls, others saw fleeting reflections of faces that weren't their own. But the mirror and Jake were never seen again. Lena had always been drawn to music. Ever since she was a child, the sound of a beautiful melody could transport her to another world. Now, as a young woman living alone in a small, quiet town, she often found solace in her piano, playing haunting tunes late into the night. One chilly autumn afternoon, Lena decided to visit the local flea market, a sprawling maze of stalls filled with all sorts of curiosities. As she wandered through the narrow aisles, her eyes were drawn to a small, intricately carved wooden box resting on a cluttered table. The box was about the size of her hand, with delicate floral designs etched into the dark wood and a small winding key on the side. The vendor, an elderly woman with a kind smile and deep-set knowing eyes, noticed Lena's interest. "Ah, the music box," she said, her voice soft yet filled with a certain weight. "It's a rare find. Some say it's enchanted." Lena chuckled, but the woman continued, her expression serious. "The melodies it plays are beautiful, but beware. Once you start listening, it's hard to stop." Intrigued, Lena bought the music box and brought it home. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she placed the box on her piano and carefully wound the key. The box sprang to life, playing a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to fill the entire room with a strange, ethereal warmth. Lena was entranced. The music was unlike anything she had ever heard before, melancholic yet soothing, as if it was telling a story of love and loss. She couldn't help but listen, her fingers tracing the delicate carvings on the box as the melody played on. Over the next few days, Lena found herself becoming obsessed with the music box. She would wind it up at every opportunity, letting the haunting tune fill her apartment. But as time went on, she began to notice something strange. The melody seemed to change subtly with each play, growing darker, more ominous, and with the changes came disturbing visions. One night, as Lena sat in the dimly lit room, listening to the music box, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. Startled, she looked up, but there was nothing there. Shaking it off, she wound the box again, and as the melody began to play, the shadows in the room seemed to dance to the rhythm of the music. Lena's heart pounded as she watched the shadows take on distinct shapes, figures of people, twisted and ghostly, their movements slow and deliberate. The air grew cold, and the once soothing melody now felt oppressive, as if it was binding her to the spot. Terrified, Lena tried to stop the music, but the box continued to play, the figures growing more defined, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and sorrow. They reached out to her, their shadowy hands stretching across the room, and she felt an icy grip tighten around her heart. In a panic, Lena grabbed the music box and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, and the music stopped abruptly, the shadows dissolving into the darkness. Breathing heavily, Lena stared at the shattered remains of the box, relief washing over her. But the silence was short-lived. From the broken pieces of the box, a soft, mournful melody began to play, the sound faint but unmistakable. Lena felt a chill run down her spine as the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. The room seemed to darken around her, and she realized with growing horror that the music box was not just an object. It was a portal, a conduit for something far more sinister. The shadows returned, more menacing than before, and this time, they didn't just reach out to her. They began to close in, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Lena backed away, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to run. The room was filled with the oppressive presence of the figures, their sorrowful cries mingling with the haunting melody. Desperate to escape, Lena ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows inching closer with every passing second. She could feel the coldness of their touch, their sadness seeping into her very soul. As the music reached its crescendo, Lena felt her strength leave her. She collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring as the shadows surrounded her, their whispers filling her ears. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shattered music box, the melody playing on, relentless and unforgiving. The next morning, Lena's neighbors found her apartment eerily quiet. The door was unlocked, and inside, they found her lying on the floor, her face pale and lifeless. The music box was gone, leaving no trace of its existence, save for a lingering melody that seemed to echo faintly through the empty room, a melody that spoke of sorrow, loss, and an ancient curse that had claimed yet another soul.